wrinkles in your face. If they gave you a facelift, they'd have enough left over to make a midget. You were 1955, we're 1985. Your day's gone, you didn't do nothing, and I understand.
Welcome, wrestling fans, again to Wrestling Real Talk. I'm your host, Rudy Rude Boy Hill, and today my very special guest co-host and my former tag team partner, wrestling legend. Of course, I must be talking about classic Chris Carter. Chris, how you doing today?
Rudy, you know, I am so happy to be part of this and to be part of with you. But I have to correct you on one thing. You said former tag team partners. We're still tag team partners.
We sure are. We're right here.
We ain't no former.
That's right. We're right here. This is Wrestling Real Talk. Now, before we go any further with Wrestling Real Talk, fans, we urge you to like and subscribe to this very channel. Of course, I'm talking about RoX-TV, where you'll find all of your favorite wrestling content in one spot, RoX-TV. Without further ado, our subject today, Chris Carter, is someone that you have had interactions with throughout the years, someone who is considered a great historian in all of professional wrestling, and someone, dare I say, loves professional wrestling more than anything in the world. I must be talking about the wild man from Louisville, of course, Jim Cornette.
Not only wrestlers, but fans, but it's a new day from this point onward.
Jim Cornette, wow, you know, what an incredible story. You know, he was born in September 17th, I believe, 1961. You know, he fell in love with wrestling at 9 years old. You know, at 9 years old, he got up on the roof of his house in Louisville, Kentucky, and erected a 10-foot antenna so he could get all the regional wrestling he could probably get and absorb it into his life at that early age. That's how much he loved wrestling.
And as the story goes, he started out as a photographer at a very young age. Like he was still in high school, and his mother's driving him around to all of these shows.
He was, and you know, and he had pictures all over the place. You know, he was with Bill Apter when he was a teenager. He just turned 13, 14 years old, and he was going to all these shows taking pictures. He knew most of the boys. Everybody accepted him. And he loved the business. Like I said, he fell in love hard with the business.
Absolutely, absolutely. He doesn't go without controversy in wrestling. By some of his controversial comments he's made in the past, and it's actually got him thrown off of several different organizations, and one that stands out to me is the NWA, when they revamped their new product with Billy Corgan. He said a joke, and it was tongue-in-cheek, but you know, the world we live in is much different than the world that he was used to managing in.
Yeah, but here in the United States, a lot of people died to have the freedom of speech. And don't get me wrong, I don't agree with Jimmy Cornette on a lot of things. But my opinion's like my ass. Everybody's got one.
He's a what you call a bad guy. He's a villain, and he doesn't want to see you guys to see him out of character. So all he's doing is staying in character and trying to entertain you in his villain persona. Oh,
were they that controversial? I don't know. I'm not really sure. But at the top of the show, we talked about a man who has passion for wrestling. Chris, here's a man who, like you, by your own admission, has true love for wrestling. This is why he has controversy and has a feud with a guy like Vince Russo.
Cornette hates New Yorkers. Period. Bro, he's still the South, the Civil War, whatever, however his mind works.
Maybe you could touch on that and the passion that, because you've known Jim Cornette a long time. You've actually did some work with him.
One of the hardest things in wrestling is to go along with the changes of the business. okay? The business changes, things change. Some of the old schoolers, and I'm an old school guy, but some of the old school guys have a real hard time keeping up with the changes. They don't like to see the changes. They like to see the way it was. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you want to be in tune with wrestling, you have to be in tune with the way it is. So you have to make adjustments. Jim, yes, controversial, yes, made comments. You've had comments with Jim Cornette. Vince Russo and Jim Cornette, they in a shoot, man, that was a very public situation with them where Vince Russo actually got a restraining order against Jim Cornette where he couldn't come within 150 feet of him. You know, Jim is a great guy. He is a wrestling aficionado. I'm telling you, if you could sit down and pick his brain for about a half hour, you would learn so much about wrestling, you would be stunned. But, you know, it's hard to come along. You know, Jim does a great podcast today. He's got 1 million people watching his podcast. So, but he just has a hard time moving along with how things are going. And we've talked about this before. Once upon a time, wrestling was wrestling. Today, wrestling is entertainment, whether you like it or not, and I don't care who says what about what. I'm a wrestler, I'm this, I'm that. You're an entertainer, and that's all there is to it. Accept that and move along with it and run with it. Don't be stuck somewhere.
Midwest Territorial Wrestling was a hotbed in Michigan. Smoky Mountain Wrestling was a hotbed in the Tennessee and Kentucky area and that West Virginia. And you, along with Gary Warncheck, started a working relationship with Jim Cornette. Will you tell us about that?
Well, first off, I want to tell you a little bit about Gary Warncheck. Gary Warncheck, I've known for over 40 years. Gary has loved wrestling. Gary was never an in-ring talent, but he was always behind the scenes. He said to me, I want to talk to you. I want to have a meeting with you. I got this idea. He wanted to come up with Midwest Territorial Wrestling, the MTW. And he really worked hard at that. And yes, Jim Cornette did come in, and he was very influential in our wrestling and with exchanging talent and things. Jim Cornette came in with the Rock and Roll Express. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that went on. Jim Cornette took our big star, Bruiser Bedlam, our champion, and took him down to Smoky Mountain Wrestling and made him a star. He beat Randy Savage in the middle of the ring in Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
Working behind the scenes with Jim Cornette, is that an intense thing, or is it pretty laid back when you personally were in that locker room with him?
Intensified, personified. There was no messing around. When we got down to work, there was no joking and laughing about anything. We got together and we hammered out what we wanted to do and how we wanted to try to bring it across to the people. And I think that made all the difference in the world with the MTW, because it was a polished product before we even got going, thanks to having people like Gary Warncheck and Jim Cornette down in the office.
When I think of Jim Cornette, I think of Jim Cornette on that scaffold match and him falling to his knees and both knees buckling and they were torn up during a Starrcade. And here's a man, once again, who did it again because he loved the business.
It's okay, it's all legal.
Why should a man like Jim Cornette still be relevant in wrestling today? Your professional opinion, Chris.
First off, you talk about the changing teams and people and everything that he went through while he was there. Jim Cornette was the glue. He was the glue that held everything together. Okay? Today, I think that with the knowledge and the experience that he has, he would be a wonderful addition to any promotion. But once again, he would have to come along with it and accept some things. And if he could do that, I would think somebody would pick him up somewhere, because he's a little bit controversial, like we talked about, and a little bit outspoken about things. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have the idea. The formula is the same, Rudy, as it's been for 100 years. The formula hasn't changed. People have changed, wrestlers have changed, the way some things are handled have changed, but the formula is still there, and Jim Cornette knows the formula.
When you think of the name Jim Cornette, what comes to mind immediately?
Once again, wrestling aficionado. I mean, he knows the wrestling business inside out, upside down, all around. He knows the wrestling business. It's just sometimes in the wrestling business, especially today, you have to control your emotion a little more. And I can understand the emotion because I feel it too, but somehow, some way I'm able to kind of adhere to what's happening today. And, you know, there's a lot of wrestlers that have had the ability to make changes and kind of get themselves reborn, so to speak. So that's something that Jim Cornette would need to do, is to become a little bit reborn, to be able to get with today. And I think things will work out really great.
Do you think Jim Cornette's over being, you know, in the wrestling business aside from his podcast? I know that from the pandemic he stopped traveling, he stopped doing the Fan Fest, he stopped doing all of that stuff. He's a big proponent of getting vaccinated. He's a big proponent of the political world. He's a guy who can't stand Donald Trump, and it's really weird because me and Jim years ago, we had a confrontation which is legendary on YouTube. You can look it up, or actually we'll show you a little clip of it here. But even back then, Jim Cornette hated change, and he hated that the Insane Clown Posse were a part of wrestling. Not knowing them, he thought they were just making a mockery of wrestling, in which sometimes they did with some of their humor. However, they were also a company, a group that paid wrestling legends better than they've ever been paid, continued to give them work over and over and over. And so I felt it fit for me to ask Jim Cornette in front of a room of people where he was doing a Q&A, why the hell do you hate the Insane Clown Posse? And he rolled up his sleeves and he went on his rant. And I looked at him and I said, oh my God, man. Oh my God, this guy is funny. He's funny. And I was like, I couldn't wait to bury him to the public. And then I started listening to his podcast, which Carlito invited me to do. And I said, I don't want to listen to that shit. He says, no, you got to listen to it. This is you. This man is you. The respect, the love, the passion, the kayfabe. This is me. And then I says, man, me and Jim Cornette could never be like that. We could never be that as far as personalities go. And then he started talking about political. He started talking about the world we live in and the controversies. And I could never have imagined that a Southern boy, a Southern-born boy like Jim Cornette would have such compassion for the liberal world, if you will. And this is not a political show, I understand that. However, it's fascinating to hear of a guy who grew up in the South, who grew up in, you know, the racially prejudiced world back then, where he would actually see the signs of whites only and, you know, colored's not allowed in here, and to see the passion that he has for change, even though he's a guy who has no passion for change when it comes to wrestling. How, does that strike you odd?
First off, for me personally, I'm here to do wrestling. So I don't give my political views. I don't give my medical views. I give my wrestling views. And as far as what you just said about seeing the prejudice in the world from the years gone past, I have sure seen that myself too. Jim, with his podcast now, on the other hand, that's a great place for him to speak his mind about whatever he feels. And I respect him for that. You know, whether it's wrestling, whether it's political, that's his place to say what he wants to say. Mm-hmm. So that's good. And yes, he has changed. This is what kind of throws me off a little bit. He is up with what's going on in the world, but he doesn't want to let the old school go in wrestling. So I think that that is something that he has to work with, that's something he has to deal with, and he has to understand once again that the world is changing, everything's changing. I look around sometimes, I think, I can't even believe this is the same place I grew up in as a child. You know? Because if somebody would have told me when I was growing up, if they said, hey, when you're in your late 60s, you're going to be addicted to an iPhone and a laptop, we've been going, this guy's from Mars, you know, but it all happens. And so Jim is a very intelligent man. You know, when he speaks, people will listen to him. So his podcast is a great place for that. I would love to see him in professional wrestling somewhere, but I would love to see him come more into today's world and understand. And it's, I don't care what anybody says. You know, I said this before, I would say it again. You're entertainers. That's just the way it is now. And, you know, get with it, man, and do what you can do. There are some unbelievable people. There are Olympic athletes in professional wrestling. Like, I think of Chad Gable. That guy was an Olympic athlete, but what a great job he does with whatever he's given to. Look at Sami Zayn. Look at, I mean, this guy, you know, the bloodline, that should be Oscar-winning performance as far as I'm concerned. I love that. So we got to have that.
Jim Cornette, Hall of Fame. Does he deserve it?
Yes, absolutely, unequivocally, without a doubt. You look at his resume, and he deserves the Hall of Fame.
When fans think of Jim Cornette, you know, when he leaves this earth, what do you think they're going to think of?
Well, I'm hoping that they think that he really made a big contribution to wrestling. When you think about Jim Cornette, after all, you know, you have to understand he was a manager, a commentator, a promoter, a booker, and an author, and a big podcaster. His resume goes on and on. It's absolutely unbelievable, the things that he's done. So it's not like he just went out there and managed. He's done every aspect of the business. So people have to understand that and then make up their minds about what they feel about him. So Jim Cornette, you know, he's been all over the place, you know. He's worked for the Continental Wrestling Association, Mid-South Wrestling, World Championship Wrestling, Jim Crockett Promotions, World Championship Wrestling, the WCW, the World Wrestling Federation, Total Nonstop Wrestling, Ring of Honor. You know, he's been all over. He's had his promotion, Smoky Mountain Wrestling. So it's not like he hasn't been around. He's been around, and he's done. When I think about what he's done in wrestling, man, I'm like, whew, man, that is a who's who of wrestling right there. So you talk about the Hall of Fame. I think that any Hall of Fame that wrestling has to offer, he should be inducted into.
Absolutely. All right, well, it looks as though we are here at the final stretch of the Jim Cornette experience, if you will, right here on Wrestling Real Talk. Chris Carter, final words on James E. Cornette.
Well, I think that James E. Cornette is one of the best wrestling managers I have ever seen in my life. And along with everything else that he's done in the wrestling business, he is so well-rounded with the wrestling business. Hall of Famer, baby, all the way.
Absolutely. When I think of Jim Cornette, I think of controversy. I think of a no-nonsense guy. I also think of a guy, which a lot of people don't know, is a very big music lover. And he's also a guy who has passion for the business. And I'm thankful that I got to mend my ways with Jim Cornette. I consider him someone that I look up to in the business. And I'm happy that he's here. I'm happy that he's still here to teach the young and the youth about history of wrestling. This has been Wrestling Real Talk. He's Chris Carter. I'm Rudy Hill. We will be back here next week, same time, same place. We'll see you then.